Tonight, Glencoe, the Scottish Highlands, 1692. The Glen of Glencoe and the MacDonalds in the winter of 1692. This is Tartan Lullaby, sleep history from Scotland. The glen is still dark. The mountains on either side hold the night a little longer than the open country does. Bidian Nam Bian rises to the south, more than 1,000 meters of quartzite and schist, and in January its upper ridges carry snow that has not thawed since November. The mountain does not announce itself in this hour. It is simply an absence of stars, a mass of darkness pressed against a sky that is only beginning very slowly to turn. The River Coe runs through the floor of the glen from east to west. It is a short river, no more than 9 miles from its source on Rannoch Moor to the point where it meets the salt water of Loch Leven. In late January, the river is running full. The rains of the previous weeks have brought it up close to its banks. The sound of it carries in the dark, a low and constant sound, not loud but always present. It has been running like this for weeks. The glen itself is narrow. At its widest, it is perhaps half a mile across. The mountains press in from both sides, and the floor of the valley is uneven, cut through by the river and by the smaller burns that come down the hillsides. There is no road through the glen in the modern sense. There is a drove road, a track wide enough for cattle and for men on foot, running roughly along the northern side of the valley floor. In wet weather, sections of it stand in water. In January of 1692, it is frozen in places and mud in others. The settlements in the glen are not villages in any tidy sense. They are clusters of low stone houses built from the material of the hillsides, roofed with turf and heather thatch. The main settlement is in the lower glen, closer to Loch Leven, in the area known as Carnock. There are other clusters further up the valley at Achnacan and in Verrigan. The houses sit close to the ground. From any distance, they look like part of the hillside. In the dark before dawn, they are invisible. The smoke from the previous evening's fires has not entirely gone. In these low stone houses, the fire is built on a central hearth or against a gable wall, and the smoke finds its way out through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. The peat burns slowly and incompletely through the night, and by the hour before dawn the inside of any house in the glen carries the smell of old peat smoke deep into the walls and the clothing and the hair of the people sleeping there. It is a smell specific to this kind of house, to this kind of fuel. There is nothing else quite like it. Peat is cut from the boggy ground above the valley floor. The higher ground to the north and east of the glen, the edges of Rannoch Moor and the shoulder of the hills, carries deep deposits of it. It has been cut here for generations. The banks where it is dug are marked by dark vertical faces in the heather, each one the record of years of cutting. In January, the year's supply is long since stacked and dried and brought down to the settlements. The stacks sit against the outer walls of the houses, low and dense, smelling faintly of earth and deep water. The sky is beginning now, not with color yet, but with a very gradual lessening of the dark above the eastern end of the glen. The glen runs roughly east to west, and the light comes in from the direction of Rannoch Moor, over the low watershed that separates the Coe from the waters that drain east toward Loch Rannoch. It does not come quickly. In January at this latitude, which is roughly 57 degrees north, the dawn is a long, slow business. The full dark gives way to grey over the course of an hour or more. The hills on the north side of the glen are called the Eannac Egach. They form a long, continuous ridge running the length of the glen, and their southern face drops steeply to the valley floor in a series of broken crags and scree fans. In summer, the lower slopes carry heather and coarse grass and patches of bog myrtle. In January, the colour is entirely gone from them. They are grey and brown and white where the snow lies in the hollows. The scree fans at their base are grey rock, fractured and angular, piled where it fell from the cliffs above over centuries of frost. Below the scree and above the valley floor, there is a narrow band of ground that is neither cliff nor flat. This is where a few of the black cattle of the glen spend the winter, or at least the part of the winter when they are not brought inside. They are a small, hardy breed, accustomed to finding grazing under snow and surviving on poorer fodder than lowland cattle would tolerate. In the hour before dawn, they stand still or move slowly on this ground, their breath visible when the light comes enough to see it, their dark coats barely distinguishable from the winter hillside. The River Coe in January is cold in a way that is difficult to convey simply by stating a temperature. The water comes from Rannoch Moor and from the snowmelt of the high corries, and it has spent very little time at lower altitudes before it reaches the glen. Where it crosses flat ground and slows, there are plates of ice forming from the edges inward each night. By the hour before dawn, these plates have thickened since midnight. A man putting his hand into the water here would not be able to hold it there for long. The smaller burns coming off the Eannac Egach are louder for their size than the main river. They come straight down the hillside over rock steps and through narrow gullies, and each one makes a distinct sound, a sharper and more broken sound than the steady run of the Coe below. Some of them are partially frozen where they cross flat rock. Ice has built up around the edges and over the shallow places, and the water runs beneath it and emerges further down in a rush. The burns have been doing this, freezing and thawing in their upper sections all through the month. The loch at the western end of the glen, Loch Leven, is tidal in its eastern arm. The water here is a mix of fresh and salt, and it does not freeze as readily as the river. In the hour before dawn, the loch is dark and flat, the colour of old iron. The tide is neither full nor empty. Small wavelets move across its surface from the direction of the open water to the west, where Loch Leven connects with the broader arm of the sea called Loch Lynn. The sound of the loch does not reach the upper settlements. It is a sound for the houses at Carnock only. The settlement at Carnock is the largest in the glen. It sits on relatively level ground close to the shore of Loch Leven, where the River Coe makes its final wide turn before entering the loch. The ground here has been worked for a long time. There are traces of older cultivation. lazy bed ridges running up the lower hillsides in the patterns that mark where potatoes and barley and kale have been grown in previous years. The lazy beds are not ploughed fields in the lowland sense. They are raised strips of improved ground, built up by hand with soil and seaweed, and whatever organic matter could be gathered, running across the slope to manage the drainage. Seaweed is carried up from the shore of the loch. It is part of the work of the settlement, this gathering and carrying. The shore at the eastern end of Loch Leven is not sandy. It is rocky, covered at low tide with the long brown racks and the bladder wrack that clings to the stones. When a storm has passed, there is more of it, torn loose and piled along the tide line. It is gathered then and carried in creels, baskets of woven willow, up to the cultivated ground. In January, this work is mostly done. The ground is resting. The activity of the agricultural year does not begin again for another 2 months. The houses at Carnock are built in a loose grouping without anything that would be called a street or a plan. They face in various directions, positioned to take advantage of ground level and to shelter from the prevailing wind, which comes in from the southwest along the axis of Loch Leven. The walls are thick, built of undressed stone, the gaps filled with smaller stones and turf and clay. The rooflines are low. A tall man can touch the apex of the thatch without reaching upward. The houses are not square. They are roughly rectangular, some of them with rounded corners where the builder followed the shape of the available stone. Inside these houses, before the dawn, the people of Glencoe are sleeping. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, who have lived in this glen for generations, are in their houses along the valley floor and the lower hillsides. The chief is MacLean, an old man now, his proper name Alastair MacDonald, a man known in the region for his height and his white hair and his long moustaches. He lives at Carnock. His 2 sons, John and Alastair, have their own households. Alastair, the younger, lives further up the glen at Inverrigan. The population of the glen is perhaps 300 people. They are farmers and cattle rearers, and in the way of all Highland communities of the period, they are also soldiers when the occasion requires it. The soldiers who have been quartered in the glen for the past 12 days are also sleeping. They arrived on the 1st of February under a Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. There are 120 of them, soldiers of the Earl of Argyll's regiment. They are billeted in the houses of the glen, distributed among the different settlements, sleeping in the same rooms as the families who have received them. This is the custom. A chief is obliged to provide hospitality. MacLean received them and directed his people to take them in. For 12 days they have eaten at the same tables and slept under the same roofs. The grey light is coming now into the eastern end of the glen. It does not yet reach the floor of the valley. It shows first on the upper slopes of Bidian Nam Bian, on the snow up there, which takes on a faint pale quality against the sky. The corries on the north face of Bidian hold their snow well into spring and sometimes beyond. The largest of them, facing north and east, is shaded for much of the winter day. In January, it receives perhaps 2 or 3 hours of direct sunlight, and on clouded days none at all. The snow in it is old and dense, and grey at the surface, where wind has worked it. The drove road through the glen is empty at this hour. In the coming months, it will carry cattle south toward the trysts at Crieff and Falkirk, the great cattle markets where Highland beasts are sold to drovers from the lowlands. The MacDonalds of Glencoe are cattle people. The size of a man's herd is a measure of his standing. The cattle wintering in the glen are mostly the small black cattle of the Highlands, but there are also some larger animals, heavier beasts acquired in raid or in trade. Cattle raiding is not unusual here. It is part of the economy of the region, governed by its own rules and expectations. The hills above the settlements hold deer in the higher reaches. Red deer, the only species on these hills, move down in winter to the lower ground, following the snow line. They are on the middle slopes now, on the heather ground below the snowfields, moving slowly and almost silently in the dark. Their antlers, if they are stags, have been shed since November. The hinds are not in calf yet. The deer are thin in January. They have been living on poor winter grazing for 2 months and will continue to do so for 2 more. The light is strengthening. The valley floor is still in deep shadow, but the sky above the eastern watershed is now distinctly lighter than the western sky. The stars above Rannoch Moor are going out, one after another, as the sky behind them brightens. To the west, the sky above Loch Lynn is still properly dark. The outline of the hills on the far shore of Loch Leven, the Mamore Hills, is just beginning to separate from the sky. Their snowy tops are the first things visible in the morning, as they were the last things visible the night before. The River Coe runs on as it has run all night. The sound of it is constant across all the variations of the dark and the coming light. It passes under the feet of anyone crossing the glen floor at any hour. It passed under the feet of the soldiers when they arrived 12 days ago. It will be running when the light is full enough to see it. Below the last of the falls, where the river flattens before the loch, a pair of dippers have their territory. They are there at every hour of the year, walking into the current on the shallow stones, disappearing beneath the surface. They do not wait for. The sky above Glencoe is the colour of cold ash. It is February, and the glen is still dark at 6 in the morning. The mountains on either side, Bidian Nam Bian to the south, and the Aenak Egach Ridge to the north, hold the valley in shadow long after the sun has risen above the surrounding peaks. The River Coe runs fast and black through the floor of the glen. There is ice at its edges this morning. The people who live here are MacDonalds. They are the Mac-Ian MacDonalds, named after their chief, Alastair Mac-Ian, who sleeps in his longhouse near the western end of the glen at Carnock. There are perhaps 500 people living in this valley and on its surrounding slopes. They are spread across several townships. Echnacken sits towards the middle of the glen. Inverugen lies slightly to the east. Inverugen sits close to the river. These are not towns in any modern sense. They are clusters of low stone and turf buildings grouped together against the wind. The first people to rise this morning are the women who tend the cattle. The cattle are not outside. They have been inside since October. In these townships, the longhouse is divided. One end holds the family, the other end holds the animals. A low stone partition, perhaps knee-height, separates the two. The warmth from the cattle's bodies has helped keep the household alive through the worst of the winter. The animals are Highland cattle, small and shaggy, dark red or black, with long curved horns. They have been eating hay since November. The hay was cut in August from the infield strips and stored in small round stacks near the buildings. It is running low now. A woman rises before her husband. She wears a linen shift next to her skin. Over this, she wraps a length of woolen cloth, undyed, the natural brown-grey color of the local fleece. It is belted at the waist with a strip of leather. Her feet are bare inside the building. She will put on leather brogues before stepping outside. The brogues are simple shoes made from untanned hide, the hair still on the outside. They are cut to fit the foot and stitched with sinew. They will be wet through within 20 minutes of walking in snow. She goes to the far end of the longhouse to check the cattle. She carries a small clay lamp. The lamp burns fish oil. It gives a low yellow light and a faint smell of the sea, even here, 30 miles from the coast. She fills a wooden pail with water from a barrel that stands near the door. The barrel was filled yesterday from the burn that runs down from the hillside above the township. She carries the water to the animals and checks their legs and hooves for signs of rot or sores from standing in wet bedding all winter. The fire at the center of the building has been smoldering all night. There is no chimney. The smoke rises slowly and escapes through a gap in the thatch at the ridge. The thatch is not straw. It is heather, cut in late summer from the hillside and laid in thick bundles over a framework of birch branches. The walls are dry stone, packed with turf on the outside for insulation. Inside, the floor is bare earth, packed hard. Near the fire, it is warm. Near the door, the cold comes through the gaps in the stone. The woman puts a pot on the fire. The pot is iron, three-legged, and it has been in the family for 2 generations. Iron is expensive here. It comes by drove road from the south or occasionally by boat along the coast. A new iron pot costs more than most families earn in a month. The pot holds water and a handful of oatmeal. This is brochen, a thin oat porridge. It is what most people in this glen will eat before they go to work this morning. The oatmeal was ground at the township's quern. The quern is a pair of flat circular stones, the upper one turned by hand. It sits in a corner of the building. The oats themselves were grown on the infield strips last summer. The infield is the small area of land closest to the township, fertilized each year with the dung from the cattle and the ash from the fire. The strips are narrow, perhaps 6 feet wide, and run down the slope to drain the water off. The soil here is thin and acid. The crop is always uncertain. Last summer was cold and wet. The harvest in August was poor. The oatmeal in the pot this morning represents something close to the bottom of the winter store. A man rises while the porridge is still warming. He is a herdsman. He manages the MacIan's cattle, tracking their condition through the winter and planning the movement to the summer sheilings when the season turns. He is perhaps 40 years old. He wears a linen shirt, also undyed. Over it, he wears a belted plaid. This is a long rectangle of woolen cloth, about 5 feet wide and 12 feet long, woven locally on an upright loom. He wraps the lower half around his waist and hips and belts it, then draws the upper half over his shoulder and pins it with a simple iron pin. The cloth is woven in a simple check pattern of dark green and brown, the colors made from local plants. The green comes from nettles boiled with the fleece before spinning. The brown comes from the bark of alder trees which grow along the river. He puts on his brogues and picks up a wooden staff. The staff is ash, cut from a tree on the lower slope and smoothed by years of handling. He will walk today to the far end of the glen, perhaps 4 miles east, to check on a group of cattle that wintered there in the care of a younger kinsman. The path follows the river. It is not a road. It is a track worn into the heather and the bog by generations of feet and hooves. In summer, it is passable enough. In February, it is frozen in some places and waterlogged in others. Another man is already outside. He is a skinner and a leather worker. His workshop is a small outbuilding attached to his longhouse at Achnacken. The building is perhaps 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. The walls are stone. There is no window. He works by the light that comes through the open door, and in winter that means he starts late and finishes early. This morning he is scraping a deer hide. The hide has been soaking in a wooden trough of water mixed with oak bark for 6 weeks. The tannin from the bark has begun to cure the hide. He scrapes it with an iron blade set into a wooden handle to remove the remaining fat and membrane. The scraping blade is called a flesher. He made the handle himself from a piece of hazel. He will make from this hide a pair of brogues, perhaps 2 pairs, and a small bag or pouch. He may also cut straps and belts. There is always work for a leather worker in a community that depends on cattle. Every harness, every shoe, every bag and strap and binding comes from his hands or from someone like him. He was taught by his father, who was taught by his father before him. There is no formal apprenticeship here. The craft passes through the family, shown and repeated until it is learned. Not far from the leather worker's outbuilding, a boy of perhaps 12 is carrying peats. The peats were cut from the bog last spring and left to dry through the summer. They are stacked in a low mound against the wall of the longhouse, covered with a piece of old hide weighted down with stones. The boy carries 3 or 4 peats at a time, pressed against his chest and chin. He makes this trip 6 or 8 times each morning. The fire must be kept going. The fire is everything. It heats the building, it cooks the food, and it dries the wet clothing that has come in from the weather outside. A woman in the next building over is spinning. She sits near the fire with a drop spindle. The spindle is a wooden shaft about 1 foot long, with a small clay whirl fixed near the lower end to keep it spinning. She draws the wool fibers out with her fingers and lets the spindle hang and turn, twisting the fibers into yarn. She spins for perhaps 2 hours each morning before the light is good enough to do other work. The wool she is spinning has been washed and combed with a pair of wooden paddles set with iron teeth. The combing straightens the fibers and removes the short ones. The longer fibers, drawn out and spun, make a strong, smooth yarn. This yarn will eventually be woven. The loom in the township is owned by the best weaver in the community, a man at Inverrigan. He is a tacksman's tenant. The tacksman is a man of some standing, a middle layer between the chief and the common folk. He holds his land directly from Mac Ian and sublets it to the people who work it. The weaver pays part of his rent in cloth. 3 ells of plain woolen cloth per year is a typical arrangement. An ell in Scotland at this time is just over 3 feet. 3 ells is enough for a single garment or a length of patching material. The weaver himself is at his loom before the morning is fully light. The loom is an upright frame of timber lashed together with rope. The warp threads hang down vertically, weighted at the bottom with smooth flat stones, each stone threaded on a length of yarn. He passes the weft thread through the shed with a stick shuttle, then beats each row down with a flat wooden sword beater. The sound is a steady thud and click. It carries through the wall of the building into the quiet morning air outside. He works slowly and steadily. A skilled weaver can produce perhaps a yard of cloth in a day. It is not quick work. There is a man in the eastern part of the glen who works as a blacksmith. He is the only blacksmith for several miles in any direction. His forge is a stone building slightly apart from the main cluster of the township. The separation is deliberate. Forges catch fire. He has a stone hearth built at chest height and a leather bellows to force air into the fire and raise the temperature high enough to work iron. The bellows is made from 2 pieces of board and a section of calfskin, sewn around the edges and fitted with a wooden nozzle. He pumps it with one hand while he holds the iron in the fire with long iron tongs. His iron stock is small. He does not smelt iron from ore. He works with bar iron that has been brought into the glen by trade. He repairs tools, makes nails, reshapes worn blades, fits iron bands onto wooden handles. This morning he is repairing a plowshare. The plow used in Glencoe at this time is a simple wooden frame with an iron share at the tip, pulled by a pair of oxen. The share wears down and chips against the stones in the thin soil. The blacksmith heats the iron tip until it glows orange, then hammers it back into shape on his anvil. The anvil is a block of iron set into a round of oak timber. It has been in this forge since before the current blacksmith's time. The plow itself will not be used for several weeks yet. February is too cold and the ground is still frozen or waterlogged, but the share needs to be ready. Plowing begins in late February or early March when the ground allows. The infield strips around each township will be turned once before the oats are sown. A man who misses the plowing window loses a season's crop. There is no margin here for delay. A young woman is walking this morning from Achnacan towards Carnock, where the chief's household stands. She carries a wooden basket on her back, held by a strap across her forehead. The basket holds dried heather and a bundle of dried rowan twigs. She will exchange these at the chief's house for a small quantity of salted mutton and perhaps a cup of barley. This is not a formal market transaction. It is part of the everyday movement of goods and obligations that holds the community together. Mac Ian's household takes and gives in kind. The people who come to his longhouse bring what they have. They leave with what they need. The walk from Echnacken to Carnock is about 2 miles. The path runs west along the south side of the river. The ground to either side of the path is rough grass and heather, brown and flattened by the winter. In the lower parts of the glen, near the river, there are scattered birch and alder trees. Their branches are bare. In summer, this stretch of the glen floor is green and, by the standards of this landscape, almost soft. In February, it is hard and grey, and the wind comes steadily down from the east, from the direction of Rannoch Moor, carrying a smell of ice and distance. She walks without hurrying. The basket is heavy, and the path is uneven underfoot. Where the path crosses a small burn, she steps on the stones, testing each one before putting her full weight on it. The burn runs fast with snowmelt from the hillside above. It has cut a shallow gully in the peat. The peat banks on either side are dark brown. The cattle are already moving before full light reaches the valley floor. The drovers set out from the settlement at the foot of the glen in the grey hour before sunrise, when the River Coe runs black and the ridgeline above is barely visible against a darker sky. The beasts are Highland cattle, small and shaggy. Their coats are deep rust and dun, their horns wide and low. They move slowly at first, still heavy with the night, picking their way along the soft ground at the river's edge. The glen itself is narrow here. The walls of rock on either side rise several 100 feet, scarred and streaked with water. The floor of the valley is wet in late winter, and the cattle find firmer ground on the slight ridge that runs parallel to the river, a few yards above the flood line. The drovers know every yard of this ground. They have walked it since childhood. The main trade of Glencoe in 1692 is cattle. It is not the only trade, but it is the one that shapes the rhythm of the year and the life of the glen. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, who number perhaps 200 souls in total, raise black cattle and shaggy highland beasts on the rough grazings above the valley floor. They move the animals to the high summer pastures, the sheelings, in June, and bring them back down before the first hard frost. The cattle are the wealth of the community. They are also its currency, its food supply, and its measure of standing. In the early weeks of February 1692, many of the cattle are still wintered in the low ground near the settlements. The main cluster of houses sits near the western end of the glen, not far from where the River Coe meets the shore of Loch Leven. This area is called Carnock. The houses here are low stone structures, thatched with heather and rush, with earthen floors and central hearths that burn peat. The cattle are kept close, in byres attached to or adjoining the main dwelling, sharing warmth through the shared wall. In the mornings, the first task is the cattle. The byre door is opened before anything else. The animals are checked for lameness, for sores, for signs of the lung sickness that can move through a herd in a wet winter. Their dung is cleared with a wooden-handled tool, flat-bladed and worn smooth, and piled at the eastern side of the byre, where it will be used on the cultivated ground later in the spring. The smell of cattle in the morning, warm and thick, mixes with the smell of peat smoke that hangs low over the settlement in still air. The feed for the animals at this time of year is hay cut in the previous summer from the meadow ground near the river. It is stored in rough stacks, thatched against the rain, in the ground near the byres. A man carries the hay by the armful, pressing it close to his chest. The cattle pull at it with their wide lower teeth and chew steadily, their breath rising in the cold air. The sound is slow and even. It is one of the defining sounds of a morning in the glen. Further up the valley, at Triochton, which sits roughly in the middle of the glen, where the valley floor widens slightly, there is a larger area of infield ground. This is the cultivated land closest to the settlement, worked every year and kept fertile with the dung from the byres. It is laid out in the run-rig system, long narrow strips that follow the contour of the ground, each family holding several strips scattered across the field rather than one continuous plot. In February, the ground is still frozen hard in the mornings, but by mid-morning, on dry days, the surface softens enough to work. The spade used in Glencoe at this time is the cascrome, the foot plough. It is a curved wooden implement fitted with an iron-shod toe, and it is worked by a single man. The operator places the iron toe against the ground and drives it forward and down with his right foot, then levers the handle back to turn a narrow slice of earth. He steps sideways along the strip, repeating the motion. The sound is a regular, dull thud against the earth, followed by the quieter sound of the sod turning. It is slower than a horse plough, but effective on the rocky, uneven ground of the highland infield, where no horse could easily work. One man working the cascrome can turn perhaps a quarter of an acre in a day of steady effort. The work requires balance more than brute strength. The body leans slightly forward, the weight comes down through the foot and into the iron toe, and the whole movement has a kind of slow rhythm to it. A group of men working the same field in parallel strips will fall into the same pace without speaking about it. The sound of their tools striking the ground comes in loose unison, like a slow and irregular drum. The crop that will eventually go into this ground is oats. Barley is grown too, a small amount, but oats are the staple. The seed grain from the previous harvest is stored in a cool, dry part of the dwelling, kept away from the cattle, protected from damp. It will not be sown until March or early April, when the ground is warm enough. For now, the work of the field in February is about preparation, turning the ground and breaking the clods, working the dung from the byres into the surface. Women carry the dung from the pile at the side of the byre to the field in wicker creels worn on the back. The creel is a large basket, deep and oval, with a band that crosses the forehead or the chest. It is heavy when full. A woman walks the same short path many times in a morning, from the byre to the field, bending to tip the creel forward and let the contents fall. The dung is then spread by hand or with a flat wooden tool. This work is not considered lesser than the work of the cascrome. It is simply different work, done by different people at the same time. The children in the settlement have tasks as well. Younger children drive the cattle to the lower grazing ground, the in-by pasture near the river, in the morning, and watch them through the day. This requires only the occasional shout or the prod of a long stick to keep the animals from straying into the field strips or toward the river bank. Older children cut peats from the peat bank on the hillside above Carnock and carry them down on their backs in small loads. Peat is the only fuel available in quantity here. There is little woodland left in the lower glen by this period, and what remains is not felled for fuel. The peat bank above Carnock has been worked for generations. It shows this in its face, a long vertical cut several feet high into the dark hillside, with the raw black peat exposed on the cut face and the older, dried peat crumbling at the edges. The tool used to cut it is the diaspora, a long-handled iron cutter with an angled blade designed to lift a rectangular block of peat cleanly from the bank. The blocks are soft and heavy when freshly cut. They are laid out on the surrounding ground to dry in the wind and, when the weather allows, in the sun. Dried peat is light, fibrous, and brown at the edges. The cutting sound of the diaspora going into the bank is a soft, sucking sound, not sharp like wood cutting, more like the sound of wet earth being divided. The smell of freshly cut peat is strong and distinct. It is the smell of decomposed vegetation, of dark water, of the hill itself opened up. In the evening, when fresh peats are laid onto a hearth fire, the smell is different, drier, with a faint sweetness. The cattle trade does not begin and end in the glen. The animals raised here are sold at cattle fairs to the south and east. The Great Tryst at Crieff, roughly 80 miles to the southeast, is the most important market for Highland cattle in this period. Drovers from Glencoe and the surrounding districts walk their herds there in the autumn, after the animals have been fattened on the summer grazings. The route south from Glencoe follows the eastern shore of Loch Leven toward Kinloch-Leven, then climbs south over difficult ground into Rannoch, and eventually reaches the lower ground approaching Crieff. The drovers who make this journey are experienced men. They know the distances between water and grass. They know where the ground is soft enough to lame a beast and where it is firm. They carry very little with them. A plaid wrapped around the body at night is shelter enough if the weather is dry. They eat oatmeal mixed with cold water, sometimes carried in a small leather bag at the belt. They sleep beside the herd at night, listening for the sounds that mean a beast is restless or has strayed. The cattle they drive are not large animals by the standards of lowland breeds. They stand perhaps 4 feet at the shoulder, but they are hardy in a way that no lowland animal could match. They can find grazing in ground that appears to hold nothing. They walk long distances without deteriorating. They arrive at Crieff thin but sound, and the buyers there know the quality of a Glencoe beast. The price at the tryst will determine the welfare of the glen for the coming year. Back in the valley in the early months of 1692, the trade is in its quieter season. The selling is done. The winter is passing. The work is the daily maintenance of the herd and the preparation of the ground. The sounds of the working day are the sounds of cattle, of the cascrome in the earth, of the teasjaya in the peat bank, of peats being stacked against the outer wall of the house, of children calling to one another across the lower pasture. The River Coe moves through all of this. It runs fast after rain, grey-green over a bed of rounded stone, and it carries snowmelt from the peaks above from January through to April. It is not navigable. It is too shallow and too fast for boats. But it provides water for the settlement at Carnock and for the cattle, and in summer it holds small brown trout that can be taken with a line or a net of twisted plant fibre. In February it is high and cold, and its sound fills the lower glen continuously, a constant background beneath all other sounds. Loch Leven lies to the west, where the glen opens. It is a sea loch, connected to the open water of Loch Lynch. The fishing on Loch Leven is part of the subsistence economy of the settlement at Carnock, though it is secondary to the cattle. Herring come into the loch in season. They are taken by net from small open boats, wooden clinker-built craft, pulled onto the shingle at the shore. The herring are eaten fresh or preserved in salt. Salt is not produced locally. It must be obtained by trade, brought in from the coast, and it is not always plentiful. A boat left on the shingle at the western edge of the settlement in February would be pulled well above the high water mark. Winter storms on Loch Leven come without much warning, driven by the southwesterly wind that funnels between the hills. The boats are heavy enough to require 3 or 4 men to move them, and they are turned hull up when not in use to keep the rain from pooling inside. The wood is maintained with fish oil or animal fat rubbed into the planking. The tools of the glen in 1692 are mostly wooden, with iron fittings where cutting or striking is needed. Iron is not made here. It is imported, worked by a smith who can be found in the wider district. The iron parts of the cascrome, the blade of the teasjaya, the hinges of the byre door, the knife at a man's belt, these things are maintained carefully. A broken iron tool is not easily replaced. A cracked handle of ash or birch can be shaped from available wood, but the iron tip must be taken to a smith's. The smith serves a wide area of the surrounding district. He works with a hearth of charcoal or peat, bellows of animal skin, an iron anvil, and hammers of varying weight. The sound of a smith's hammer on iron carries a long distance in still air. It is a ringing, irregular sound, different in pitch depending on the work being done. Thin iron rings high, thick iron rings lower and slower. The mornings in the glen in this period are long in terms of work, but short in terms of light. In early February, the sun does not clear the eastern ridge until well after 8 o'clock, and it drops behind the western peaks by mid-afternoon. The working day is shaped by this. The heaviest outdoor work is done in the few hours of. The fire had been burning since before dawn. It sat in a shallow pit at the center of the floor, built directly onto the earth, with no grate beneath it and no chimney above. The smoke rose slowly through the room and found its way out through a small hole in the thatch. On cold nights, which were most nights in Glencoe, the fire was never allowed to go out entirely. The houses of Glencoe in 1692 were called black houses, though the people who lived in them did not use that term themselves. They were built from the stone that lay everywhere in the glen, dry-stacked without mortar, the walls sometimes 6 feet thick at the base. The roof was timber and heather thatch, held down in places by weighted ropes of twisted heather. The walls were low, rarely more than 5 feet to the eaves, and a tall person had to stoop to pass through the doorway. Inside, the floor was the same earth as outside. It was beaten down over years until it was hard and dark. Near the fire, it was sometimes covered with flat stones. Rushes and dried heather were spread across the rest of the floor to keep the worst of the cold from rising through the soles of the feet. These were changed when they became too damp or too foul, which was not always as often as a visitor might have wished. The single room served every purpose. Cooking happened at the fire in the center. Sleeping happened along the walls, on low wooden frames, or directly on the heather bedding. In many households, there was no division at all between the end of the room, where the family slept, and the end where the cattle stood through the winter months. A low stone partition, sometimes no higher than a man's knee, was the only separation. The warmth of the animals helped to heat the space. The cattle that shared the house were small and dark, the native Highland cattle of the glen. A family might have kept 2 or 3 beasts through the winter, brought inside in October or November, and kept there until April. They were fed on whatever hay had been cut and dried during the summer months. The smell of the animals and the smell of the peat smoke were the 2 constant facts of the interior. Everything in the house absorbed both. The furniture was sparse and mostly low. There was a wooden chest for storing whatever cloth and clothing the family possessed. There was a 3-legged stool or 2 near the fire. There was a rough wooden table in some houses, though many families ate sitting on the floor or on low benches. Iron was expensive and not wasted. The pot that hung over the fire on an iron chain was one of the most valuable objects in the household. It was used every day and treated accordingly. That pot held the basis of most meals. Oatmeal was the staple of the diet in 1692, as it had been for generations. It was cooked into a thick porridge called brochen, or made into oatcakes on a flat stone beside the fire. A family would have kept a wooden barrel of oatmeal ground at the local mill as their central food store. Kale was grown in small enclosed plots near the house and added to the pot with water and whatever else was available. On a good day, there might be some dried fish, some salt herring, or a piece of salted mutton. Milk was a significant part of the diet when the cattle were giving it, which was from spring through to autumn. It was drunk fresh, allowed to sour naturally, or made into a soft cheese. Butter was churned and sometimes preserved in the peat bog, which kept it from spoiling. Whey, the liquid left from cheese making, was drunk as well. Very little was wasted from the dairy. The winter months were leaner because the cows dried up as the cold came in. Meat appeared at the table more often than it did in some parts of Scotland, because the glen ran its cattle as its principal form of wealth. But cattle were not killed for daily eating. They were the savings of the family, driven to the tryst at Crieff each autumn to be sold. A beast killed for the household would have been a significant event. Sheep were a little more commonly eaten. Goats too were kept, and their milk was used in the same ways as cattle milk. The fish of the River Coe were available throughout the year. Salmon ran through the river in season. Trout could be taken with a line or a trap from the pools beneath the slopes of Baidian Nam Bayan. For a family living close to the river, fish was a reliable supplement to the meal, though the rights to certain pools were matters of custom and sometimes of dispute. The sea loch at the foot of the glen, Loch Lynn, lay not far distant, and sea fish were brought up from there as well. The children of Glencoe in 1692 began working from an early age. A child of 6 or 7 would have been set to herding the cattle on the lower slopes during the summer months, keeping them from wandering into the cultivated rigs where the barley and oats were growing. This was a recognized task given to children, and they performed it largely unsupervised for the full length of a summer day. They would have known the ground of the glen in considerable detail by the time they were 10 years old. Clothing for children was not substantially different from clothing for adults. Both wore a woolen garment over a linen shift. The outer garment for men and older boys was the belted plaid, a length of coarse woolen cloth roughly 6 yards long and 2 yards wide, belted at the waist and draped over the shoulder. The wool was woven locally on simple looms. It was not the bright tartan of a later period. The colors were the natural dyes of the glen, browns, ochres, a dull green from the weld plant, and the natural grey and cream of undyed wool. Women wore a length of cloth called an araced, which was similar in form to the male plaid but worn differently, pinned at the breast and belted lower at the waist. Beneath it was a linen shift, the lane, which was gathered and pleated. The linen for the shift was grown, retted, spun, and woven within the community. Women's footwear was simple leather brogues or none at all. In summer, barefoot was common for both sexes and all ages. In the cold months, leather shoes stuffed with dried grass helped against the frost. The women of the household managed the dairy work, the spinning and the weaving, the preservation of food, the making of butter and cheese, the cutting and drying of peat, and the preparation of every meal. This was not a secondary role. The survival of the household depended on these tasks being done correctly and consistently. A woman who understood the timing of the peat cutting, the management of the milk, and the proper drying of the oat harvest was carrying much of the practical knowledge on which the family's winter depended. Peat was cut from the bog above the glen floor in late spring, stacked to dry through the summer, and carried down to the house in creels on the backs of women and older children. The creel was a basket woven from willow or hazel, worn on the back with a strap across the forehead. It was used for carrying peat, for carrying dung to the fields, and for carrying fish from the river. The same design served multiple purposes, as most tools in the glen were made to do. The sleeping arrangements within the house were simple and communal. The family slept together on a bed of heather and bracken laid against the wall, covered with plaids and whatever spare cloth was available. There was no concept of a separate sleeping room for children and adults. The youngest children slept closest to the warmth. The fire banked down at night with a layer of ash to keep the embers alive until morning, provided what heat there was. The darkness of the house at night was almost complete. Light inside the house after dark came from the fire itself and from small rush lights. A rush light was made by soaking the pith of the common rush in rendered animal fat, usually mutton fat. It gave a low, guttering light sufficient for close handwork. Tallow candles existed, but were not commonly used in ordinary households. Spinning could be done by firelight with practice. Reading required more light than most households could regularly provide, and in any case literacy in Gaelic was not widespread in the Glen in this period. The language of daily life was entirely Gaelic. The structure of the household was organized around the clan system that governed life throughout the Glen. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, under Alastair Mac Ian, their chief, formed a tight community of perhaps 300 to 400 people in the valley. The chief was not a distant figure. He lived among them at Carnock near the foot of the Glen, in a house that was larger than those of his tenants, but built on the same principles. The relationship between a chief and his people in the Highland Glen of 1692 was one of mutual obligation. Each family owed the chief military service, labor on certain tasks, and a portion of the produce of their land. In return, they received his protection, his arbitration in disputes, and access to the land on which they lived and grazed their cattle. The land itself was not owned by the individual families. It was held by the chief and allocated by custom and usage. The township lands were worked collectively in some respects, with the rigs of the open field distributed among the tenants. The cultivation strips, or rigs, were narrow and lay on the flatter ground along the floor of the glen beside the River Coe. The soil of Glencoe is thin and stony, and the growing season is short at the altitude of the glen floor. Barley was the main cereal crop alongside oats. The barley, called bearer, was a hardy four-roed variety suited to the wet, cool conditions of the highlands. It was sown in April when the ground was soft enough to work with a cascrome, the foot plough, a long wooden implement with an iron toe, levered into the earth by foot to turn the soil. The harvest was cut in August or September, dried, and stored in a small stone barn or within the house itself. The threshing was done with wooden flails through the autumn and winter months. The grain was then taken to the mill to be ground. The nearest mill served the whole community, and was an important point of social gathering. Waiting for the millstone was a time when people talked, exchanged news, and settled small matters of the community's business. Water came from the burns that ran down from every slope in the glen. There was no shortage of it. The River Coe and its many tributaries drained the steep sides of the mountains on both sides, and in all but the driest summer months, clean water was close to every house. It was carried in wooden vessels or in leather containers. The wooden stave bucket, bound with willow withies, was the standard domestic water carrier. It served for cooking, for washing, and for watering the animals. The glen itself in 1692 was shaped quite differently to what it would later become. There was much more woodland on the lower slopes. Birch, alder, rowan, and hazel grew thickly in places along the sides of the valley and beside the river. Oak woodland existed on the south-facing slopes. This wood was a resource used for fuel, for building, for tool handles, for basket weaving, and for the charcoal needed by the small amounts of ironwork the community required. The open moorland that now dominates much of the highland landscape had not yet been stripped of its trees by centuries of sheep grazing that came later. The day in a Glencoe household in 1692 began well before light. The fire had to be coaxed back from the banked embers. Water had to be brought. The animals had to be tended. The oat porridge had to be set on early enough to be ready when the household needed it. A morning meal in winter might have been taken in near-complete darkness, sitting close to the fire before the day's work began. The work outside in January and February, when the snow lay on the Eanach Ridge above the north side of the glen and the frost held in the valley floor, was limited to what was necessary. Peat had to be brought in from the stack beside the house. The animals had to be fed and watered. Beyond that, the short days were spent indoors, spinning, repairing tools, working the leather for shoes or harness, telling stories and waiting for. The glen settles into quiet by late afternoon in January. The light goes early here. By 3 o'clock, the hills on either side have taken the sun, and the floor of the valley lies in a cold, grey shadow that will not lift until morning. The people of Glencoe in 1692 were MacDonalds almost to a man. They were part of the clan MacDonald of Glencoe, a small but distinct branch of the wider MacDonald kindred. The chief at this time was MacLean, Alastair MacDonald, a tall man well into his 60s, known across the region for his bearing and his stubbornness in equal measure. He lived at the western end of the glen, at Carnock, near where the River Coe meets the salt water of Loch Leven. The settlement at Carnock was not a town in any formal sense. It was a loose gathering of longhouses built low against the ground, their walls made from rough-cut stone and packed earth, their roofs thatched with heather or turf. The floors inside were beaten earth. A central hearth burned peat, and the smoke rose slowly through a hole in the roof. There were no chimneys in most of these houses. The smoke found its own way out, or it did not. Further along the glen, smaller clusters of buildings sat at intervals on the valley floor and on the lower slopes. These were the township clusters the Gaelic-speaking people called Bailtian, the plural of baile, meaning a settlement or a town place. Each baile held several families, perhaps 4 or 5 households sharing the surrounding land in a system of runrig cultivation. Strips of arable ground were allocated by lot each season, so that no single family held the same piece of ground year after year. This was the common farming practice across the Highlands in this period. The arable land in the glen was limited. The valley floor was narrow, hemmed in by the steep ridges of Eannac Egach to the north and the great mass of Bidian Nam Bayan to the south. What flat ground existed near the river was subject to flooding in winter. The people cultivated what they could, growing mainly beara, which was a hardy form of barley suited to the short highland growing season. Some oats were grown as well. Kale and other leafy vegetables were kept in small enclosures close to the houses. The main crop was almost always beara. Cattle were the true measure of wealth in Glencoe in 1692. The black cattle of the Highlands were small, hardy animals, capable of surviving on poor grazing through a long winter. The MacDonalds kept their herds on the valley floor through the winter months and drove them up to the high summer pastures, the sheelings, when the snow cleared from the upper slopes, usually in May or June. Women and young people went with the cattle to the sheelings and stayed there through the summer, making butter and cheese from the milk. The men remained in the main settlements below, tending the crops. The rhythm of the year was determined almost entirely by these two movements. In spring, the cattle went up. In autumn, they came back down. Around these movements, the rest of life arranged itself. The cutting of peat happened in late spring, after the ground had dried a little. The peats were stacked and left to dry through the summer, then brought down to the settlements before the first frosts of October. Each household needed a substantial stack of dried peat to see it through the winter months. There was no formal market town in the glen itself. For significant trading, the people of Glencoe looked to Inverlochy, which sat at the southern end of the Great Glen, near where Fort William now stands. The garrison at Inverlochy had existed in various forms since the 1650s, when General Monk had built a fort there during the Cromwellian occupation of Scotland. By 1692, it was known as Fort William, having been refortified and garrisoned by government troops. A small settlement had grown up around the fort. This was the nearest thing to a market town that the people of Glencoe could reach with reasonable effort. The journey from Carnock to Inverlochy covered roughly 15 miles by the most direct route, following the southern shore of Loch Leven to Ballachulish and then south along the shore of Loch Lynn. It was not a journey made lightly in winter. The tracks were rough and often waterlogged. A man on foot could make it in a long day. A man with cattle or goods to carry would take longer. Most trading journeys happened in the better months of the year, between April and October. There were also smaller informal gatherings closer to home. The men of the glen would meet after a cattle drove or at the making of a shealing, or when a boat came in from Loch Leven. These were not organized markets in any legal or commercial sense. They were exchanges between neighbors, conducted in Gaelic, with goods changing hands according to what each household needed and what it had to spare. A man might trade a quantity of dried peat for a share of smoked fish. Another might exchange a young animal for a bolt of rough woolen cloth. Cloth was made within the glen. Women spun wool on hand spindles and on the small spinning wheels that had become more common across the Highlands during the 17th century. The cloth they wove was coarse and heavy, well suited to the wet cold of the Highland winter. Men wore belted plaids, lengths of woven wool gathered and belted at the waist, with the upper portion thrown over the shoulder. Women wore wool skirts and linen shifts. Shoes were simple brogans, cut from untanned hide and stitched roughly at the seam. Many people went barefoot through the summer months. Religion in Glencoe in 1692 was a complicated matter. The MacDonalds of Glencoe were in the main Roman Catholic, which set them apart from much of lowland Scotland, which had been predominantly Presbyterian since the Reformation of 1560. The Presbyterian Church had no strong institutional presence in the upper reaches of the Glen. There was no parish church building within Glencoe itself in the early 1690s. The nearest parish church for formal Church of Scotland purposes was at Lismore, some distance to the southwest, across the water of Loch Linnhe. Catholic observance in a place like Glencoe in this period was quiet and domestic. Priests moved through the Highland region in a semi-covert manner, traveling from one Catholic household to another, celebrating Mass in private homes or in barns or in the open air when weather permitted. A visiting priest might stay with MacLean for several days, hearing confessions, baptizing children, and performing marriages that had been waiting for his arrival. The religious calendar was known and followed, but its observance depended entirely on when a priest could be found. Sunday in the Glen was a day of lighter labor rather than complete rest. The cattle still needed water, the fire still needed fuel, but heavier agricultural work was laid aside, and people gathered in small groups, family by family, at the hearth. If a priest was present, Mass would be said. If not, older forms of observance carried on quietly, prayers spoken in Gaelic, beads counted by firelight, the names of saints invoked at the beginning and the end of the day. The Catholic feast days marked the turning of the year in a way that the agricultural seasons reinforced. Candlemas, which fell on the 2nd of February, was the feast of the purification of the Virgin. It came at the very bottom of the winter, when the peat stacks were running low and the cattle were thin. Its arrival was noticed and marked, not with great ceremony, but with awareness. People knew what the day was. They had known it since childhood. Beltane, the 1st of May, was the great summer threshold. It was older than Christianity in the Highlands, though by 1692 it had been folded into the Catholic and then the folk calendar in a way that made its origins hard to separate from its later meaning. Fires were lit on the hillsides on the eve of Beltane. Cattle were driven between two fires or through the smoke of a single fire as a protection against disease for the coming season. The movement to the sheilings often began around this time, sometimes exactly on the 1st of May, sometimes a few days before or after, depending on the state of the grass on the upper slopes. Samhain, the 1st of November, marked the return from the sheilings and the beginning of the dark half of the year. It was the time when cattle were assessed and decisions were made about which animals could be kept through the winter and which had to be slaughtered. Salting and smoking of meat happened in the days around Samhain, when the killing was done and the carcasses needed preserving quickly in the cold air. This was one of the most important practical events of the entire year. Midwinter was cold and largely dark. In January of 1692, the days in Glencoe were barely 7 hours long. By 7 in the evening, the glen was entirely black, except for the glow of peat fires visible through the low doorways. People spent the long winter evenings close to the fire, spinning, repairing tools, telling stories. The oral tradition was strong in Gaelic-speaking communities. Men who were known for their memory of genealogy and legend held a particular kind of respect. The recitation of clan ancestry, the names of chiefs going back for generations, was a form of social ceremony in itself. Gathering around the fire of an evening was not merely domestic habit. It was how information moved through the community. News from outside the glen, the movements of government troops, the decisions of great lords, the prices being offered at distant markets, all of this arrived by word of mouth and was discussed at these fireside gatherings. There were no newspapers in the Highlands in 1692. Very few people in the glen could read at all. The spoken word carried everything. Births, marriages, and deaths were the occasions around which the community organized itself most visibly. A wedding in the glen was a gathering of the extended family and the neighboring Bailtian. A feast was made from whatever was available. Music was played on the fiddle and on the Highland pipes. The bagpipe tradition in the Western Highlands at this time was closely associated with the MacCrimmon family on the Isle of Skye, who were the hereditary pipers to the MacLeods. But every clan community had its own pipers and its own piping traditions. Music at a wedding or a feast was not a performance by one person for an audience. It was something the whole gathering participated in, singing, clapping, dancing in the firelight. The community also gathered for collective agricultural labor. The cutting of hay in July required many hands working quickly before the weather changed. Neighbors helped neighbors with this, knowing that the help would be returned when their own cutting time came. The digging and planting of the bearer strips in spring was similarly a collective effort. These working gatherings had their own social character. Food and drink were shared. Songs were sung while working. The harvest, such as it was in a glen of this altitude and climate, was a moment of relief as much as celebration. Uisge Beatha whiskey was made and drunk in the glen, though not in vast quantities by individual households. Illicit distilling was widespread across the Highlands in this period, practiced quietly and without much attempt at concealment by local authority. The spirit was made from malted bearer and was rough by comparison with what would later be produced under regulated conditions. It was drunk at gatherings, offered to guests, and used as a form of currency in informal exchanges. A cask of spirit might change hands at a shealing meeting or after a cattle drove. Loch Leven provided fish throughout the year. The loch was tidal at its western end, opening into the sea at Ballachulish. Herring came into the sea lochs of the Western Highlands seasonally, and the MacDonalds fished from small open boats using nets. Salmon ran in the River Coe, trout were taken from the burns. Fish were smoked or salted for preservation. In a poor summer, when the bearer failed to ripen fully before the autumn rains came, the fish from the loch and the river were what stood between a household and serious hunger. The western end of the glen, around Carnock and the mouth of the River Coe, was the busiest part of the community in social terms. This was where MacLean lived. His house was larger than the other longhouses, though not dramatically so. His status was demonstrated less through his dwelling than through the number of men around him, the fosterage relationships that bound families to him, and the quality of the hospitality he kept. Hospitality was a serious obligation in Highland society in 1692. To turn away a guest unfed was a disgrace. To shelter an enemy who had asked for protection was a duty that overrode personal feeling. The bonds of kinship extended outward from the glen in networks that connected the MacDonalds of Glencoe to other MacDonald branches, to the MacDonalds of Keppoch to the northeast, and to the wider Jacobite sympathies that ran through the Catholic and Episcopalian communities of the Highlands. These were not abstract political allegiances. They were relationships between named people, cemented by fosterage, by marriage, by shared memory of. The glen lay quiet in February. The River Coe moved slowly under a skin of ice at its edges, dark water pushing through the center channel where the current kept the frost back. Snow had come down from the Eanach-Egach Ridge and settled on the valley floor in the days before. It did not melt. At that altitude, in that month, it rarely did before March. The glen runs roughly east to west for about 8 miles. It begins near the flat ground at Rannoch Moor and narrows as it descends toward the sea loch at its western end. Loch Triochton sits near the middle of the valley floor. It is a small loch, shallow in summer, fed by burns coming down from the North Ridge. In February of 1692, it would have been frozen hard enough to walk on. The River Coe drains the whole glen. It collects water from perhaps a dozen small burns before it reaches the sea at Loch Leven. The loch itself is a sea loch, an arm of salt water running inland from the Firth of Lorne. At its western mouth, the tidal range could reach nearly 4 feet. Seawater pushed inland on the flood tide each day, and the river water pushed back against it. Where they met, the water was brackish and slightly discolored with peat. Loch Leven had no harbour in 1692 in any formal sense. There were landing places. flat stones at the water's edge where boats could be dragged up. The settlement at Ballachulish was a small cluster of dwellings on the south side of the Loch Narrows. Ferries crossed there. They were open wooden boats, rowed by hand, wide enough to carry a horse if it stood still. The crossing was short, but the current at the Narrows was strong on the ebb. The moorland above the glen was vast. Rannoch Moor stretched away to the east, more than 50 square miles of blanket bog and open water. In 1692, there were no roads across it. There were tracks, worn into the heather by generations of cattle and people moving on foot. The ground was almost entirely waterlogged below the surface. Sphagnum moss held the water in the peat like a sponge. In summer, the moss was green and copper and rust-colored in patches. In February, it was flattened under snow and showed only as dark shapes beneath the white. The peat on Rannoch Moor had been accumulating for roughly 8,000 years by that point. In places, it was more than 20 feet deep. People cut it for fuel. The cutting happened in May and June, when the surface dried enough to work. They used a peat iron, a spade with a wing on one side that cut the block in a single push. The blocks were stacked in small pyramids to dry through the summer and carried home before the autumn rains. The tree line in Glencoe in 1692 sat higher than most people now expect. There were still significant stands of Scots pine on the lower valley slopes, particularly on the south-facing ground above the river. Birch grew densely along the burns. Alder stood at the water's edge, wherever the bank was flat enough to hold soil. Rowan trees appeared singly on the hillsides, growing from cracks in rock outcrops where deer could not easily reach them. The overall impression of the valley floor was of open woodland broken by pasture and bog, not the bare, treeless landscape that exists today. A generation earlier, around 1650, that tree cover had been somewhat thicker. The difference was not dramatic, but it was real. Cattle grazing had always suppressed regeneration. Young trees that sprouted in spring were browsed off before they could establish. The woodland shrank slowly, a few yards at the margins each decade. By 1692, the process had been going on long enough that the upper slopes, above roughly 1,200 feet, were almost entirely bare. Only wind-shaped scrub survived in sheltered gullies above that line. The cattle were central to everything. The MacDonalds of Glencoe kept black cattle, the small hardy breed native to the highlands. They were taken up to the summer shearings on the high ground above the valley in late May or early June. The women and children went with them. They lived in small stone and turf shelters near the grazing grounds for 2 or 3 months, making butter and cheese from the milk. The men stayed lower, tending the crops and cutting the hay. The shealing structures were simple, walls of dry stone 2 or 3 feet thick, low enough that a person had to duck to enter. The roof was timber poles covered with turf. They were not meant to be comfortable. They were working shelters, used for a few months and then left. Some had been used by the same families for generations. The locations were known and remembered. Rights to particular shearings were part of the fabric of local tenure. By late October, the cattle came back down. They were driven along the valley floor and pennied near the settlement buildings for the winter. The pasture on the valley floor had been rested through the summer months and was grazed down hard through autumn and early winter. By January, the animals were thin. They were fed hay that had been cut and dried the previous summer, stored in the byres or in covered stacks outside. In a bad winter, the hay ran short before the spring grass came. Animals died. It was expected. The hay meadows occupied the flat ground along the river and around Loch Triochton. They were managed carefully. The meadows were kept free of cattle through the summer months, specifically to allow the grass to grow long enough to cut. The cutting was done in July with scythes, turned and dried over several days, then raked into rows and stacked. The quality of the hay varied with the weather. A wet July produced poor hay that rotted in the stack and fed animals badly through the winter. Oats were the principal crop in the glen. They were grown on the infield ground close to the township settlements. The infield was the most fertile land, kept in continuous cultivation and heavily manured with animal dung, and sometimes with seaweed brought up from Loch Leven. Oats were sown in April and harvested in September, cut with a hook and bound into sheaves. The grain was dried in a small kiln before grinding. It was ground at a hand quern or at a mill where one existed. Oatmeal was the staple food. A generation earlier, around 1650, the cultivation pattern had been broadly similar. The same crops, the same rotation between infield and outfield, the same dependence on cattle. What had changed was the pressure on the land. The population of the glen had grown modestly in the intervening 40 years. More mouths meant more ground under cultivation. The outfield edges had been pushed slightly further up the slopes. Some ground that had been rough pasture in 1650 was being ploughed by 1692, not productively, but out of necessity. The salmon were important. The River Coe held good runs of Atlantic salmon in autumn. Sea trout came through in summer. Both fish entered the river from Loch Leven, working their way upstream to spawn on the gravel beds in the upper reaches. They were taken with nets strung across the shallower pools, and occasionally with a lesgian, a kind of barbed spear used at night by torchlight. The fish were eaten fresh when caught in quantity and preserved by salting or smoking for the winter months. Eels were also present in the loch and river system. They were taken in basket traps woven from hazel withies, set overnight in the slower sections of the river. Eels were a useful secondary food source, less valued than salmon, but reliable. They were sometimes dried for storage. The loch also held brown trout, pike in the weedy shallows, and perch in small numbers. None of these were managed in any organized way. They were simply taken when needed. The deer on the surrounding hills were a resource controlled by those with the authority to claim them. Red deer wintered on the lower slopes and valley floor when snow pushed them down from the high ground. They competed directly with cattle for the limited winter grazing. In 1692, red deer were numerous across the highlands. They were taken by communal drives, the Tinchel, where large groups of men walked in a wide arc across the hillside and gradually tightened the circle until the deer were concentrated in a killing ground below. The method was ancient and it worked. The vegetation above the treeline in winter was almost monochrome. Dead grass, brown and flat, dark heather stems, grey quartzite scree on the north face of Buachale Etive Moor, the pale grey of lichen on exposed rock. The south ridge of the glen, the Aonak Egach, rises to just over 3,000 feet. Its crest is a narrow arete of rock. In February, it held snow cornices on its north-facing edges that could overhang by several feet before they broke and fell. The burns coming down from the ridges cut deeply in places. They had carved ravines in the softer ground below the rock faces. These ravines held dense vegetation on their sheltered sides, birch and rowan and willow, growing where grazing animals could not easily reach. They were cooler and damper than the open hillside above them. In summer, they were green when everything around them was dry and brown. In winter, they were the last places where snow melted, and sometimes the first where it settled again. The boggy ground on the valley floor was crossed by a series of informal paths between the township clusters. These paths followed the slightly firmer ground where possible. They skirted the worst of the wet areas, threading between hummocks of tussock grass and peat. In wet weather, they became difficult. In winter, when the surface froze, they were easier to walk. The frost made the ground firm. A hard frost was in some ways useful. Cattle paths on the hillsides were visible as narrow terraced lines running roughly along the contour. The animals followed the same routes year after year, carving shallow horizontal shelves into the turf. From a distance, these looked almost deliberate, like steps cut into the hillside. They were not. They were simply the result of hooves pressing into the same ground over generations. In 1692, those same terraces could still be seen on slopes where cattle had grazed for 200 years or more. The smoke from the township at the head of the glen would have been visible from a considerable distance on a calm day. Peat burns with a dense, low smoke that hangs in still air. The dwellings were clustered together on slightly raised ground above the flood level of the river. Their walls were of unmortared stone packed with turf and earth, thick enough to hold warmth but low enough to prevent the wind from catching them. The roofs were thatched with heather or rushes over a timber frame, and they laked in heavy rain. The interior was dark. The fire burned on a central hearth, and the smoke found its way out through a hole in the roof or simply through the thatch itself. The animals were sometimes kept in the lower end of the same building through winter, separated from the living space by a low partition. The warmth from the cattle helped heat the dwelling. The smell was permanent and unremarkable to those who lived there. In 1650, the dwellings had been almost identical in construction and arrangement. The building tradition changed very slowly. Stone was abundant. The method worked well enough. There was no reason to change it. The passes out of the glen were important. The road through the glen toward the east did not exist in any modern sense in 1692. there was a track. It followed the valley floor as far as Altnafeed, where the ground rises steeply toward the edge of Rannoch Moor. From there the track climbed the Devil's Staircase, a series of zigzags up the western face of the moor edge, before leveling out onto the flat open ground of the moor itself. The name came later. In 1692, it was simply the way east toward Loch Rannoch and beyond. The western approach to the glen was easier. The ground opens out as the valley descends toward Loch Leven. The river slows and widens. The valley floor broadens to several hundred yards. Alder woodland grew thickly along both banks of the lower river in 1692, and the ground between was soft with moss and sedge. Cattle moved through it in single file on the firm path. In flood conditions, after heavy rain or snowmelt, the lower valley floor was entirely under water, and the path disappeared beneath the river for days at a time before the level fell back and the route opened again. The high water left a line of debris across the grass, a mark of how far the river had reached, and that line remained visible in the turf until the spring growth covered it and the land looked undisturbed once more, as though the water had never come at all and the valley had always been. The light goes first from the high ridges. The peaks of Bidian Nam Bian hold a pale gold for a little while after the glen floor has fallen into shadow. Then that too fades. The colour drains out of the sky somewhere above Loch Leven, and the glen becomes a long, dim corridor of grey and brown and darkening green. It is February, the first day of February 1692. The air in the glen has been cold all day, and now, with the sun gone, it sharpens. The frost comes down from the mountains as if poured. It settles on the rough ground, on the heather stalks, on the stone walls of the small houses that sit along the valley floor and up the lower slopes. The River Coe, runs black between its banks. The houses of the MacDonalds of Glencoe are low and solid. They are built from the local stone, which is grey and dark and plentiful. The walls are thick, a good 2 feet in places, packed with turf between the inner and outer faces to hold what heat there is. The roofs are thatched with heather and bracken, laid in tight, overlapping courses. From a distance, in the last of the light, each house seems to grow from the ground rather than sit upon it. There are perhaps 500 people living in the glen at this time. They are spread across several townships. Carnock lies near the western mouth of the glen, close to where the River Coe meets the edge of the loch flat. Inverrigan sits a little further east, a loose cluster of buildings on the valley floor. Echnacken is further in still, tucked against the slopes. These are not towns in any formal sense. They are groups of houses and outbuildings, byres and barns, arranged without much plan, following the shape of the land. The cattle are coming in now. They have been out on the lower ground through the day. What grazing there is in February, the rough grass along the river margins, the tufted ground where the snow has not lain. Young men and boys are moving them towards the byres. The animals go slowly and without urgency. They know the routine. Their breath makes small clouds in the cold air. The sound of them, the low movement of hooves on frozen earth, carries across the quiet glen. The byre is attached to many of the houses or sits directly alongside. The warmth of the cattle seeps through the shared wall, and this is not incidental. It is part of the design. A family's cattle are also, in a very real sense, a family's hearth. The animals are bedded on bracken and dried heather. The smell is strong and familiar. Children who have grown up here do not notice it. Visitors sometimes do. The central hearth of each house is a simple thing. A flat stone or a shallow depression in the earth floor sits roughly in the middle of the main room. The fire burns on it directly. There is no chimney in the conventional sense. The smoke rises and finds its way out through a hole in the thatch, or through the gaps that the thatch never quite closes. The walls and the underside of the roof are black with years of accumulated smoke. Everything in these houses carries that smell: the clothing, the bedding, the food. Peat is the fuel. It has been cut and dried through the summer and stacked outside each house. A woman brings in an armful now in the early evening and lays the blocks carefully on the fire. Peat burns slowly. It gives a steady, deep heat rather than a fierce one. The flame is low and orange. It does not illuminate the room very much. The room is lit more by the fire's glow than by any distinct flame. Faces on the far side of the room are half in shadow. The meal being prepared tonight is simple. It will be simple on almost every night of this winter. Oatmeal is the base of almost everything eaten in the glen. It is made into a thick porridge, stirred over the fire in a large iron pot. The pot hangs from a chain fixed to a beam above the hearth, or rests on a trivet of iron set among the peats. The stirring is steady work, done with a long wooden stick. The porridge thickens slowly and must not be left. Kale is in the pot as well in many houses. It is one of the few green things that survives a highland winter. It grows in small, sheltered patches near the houses, behind stone enclosures that keep the wind off. In February, it is tough and dark and strong-tasting, but it is there, and that matters. The kale goes into the pot with the oatmeal and with water, sometimes with a small piece of salted meat, if the autumn's salting has gone well, and if the winter has not yet used it up. Milk is another staple. The cattle are the source of it, and in February the milk is less plentiful than it will be in spring and summer. What there is has been carefully managed. Some has been made into a soft cheese over the preceding weeks. Some has been kept as buttermilk. The buttermilk is drunk at the evening meal, brought to the table in a wooden bowl or a clay vessel. It is sour and thin. It is also nourishing and filling, and that is what counts. There is bread of a kind, oatcakes, baked on a flat iron griddle that sits over the fire. They are thin and hard and have been made earlier in the day. They cool quickly in the February air and become very crisp. They are eaten alongside the porridge or dipped into the buttermilk. They carry no flavor of their own to speak of, but they are solid, and a man who has been out on the hillside all day is not looking for flavor. He is looking for weight in his stomach. The men of the glen have been occupied through this winter day in the ways that a February day in 1692 allows. Some have been cutting peats. Others have been tending the cattle, moving them, checking them, looking at the condition of the animals that will need to carry the household through until the grass comes in spring. Some have been working on tools, repairing the wooden handles of spades and mattocks, twisting new rope from heather roots and rushes, mending harness. The work of winter is maintenance and preparation. It is quiet work, done largely indoors or in the byre, done by hand and by firelight. Women have been spinning. The distaff and spindle are constant companions through the winter months. The wool comes from the sheep that graze the upper slopes in better weather and are brought lower now. It is spun into a rough, strong yarn. The yarn will be woven on a simple loom, a few of which exist in the glen, into the cloth that makes the plaids and the shirts and the basic garments of the household. The women of the glen are also the carriers of water, from the river or from the small burns that come down the hillsides, and they have been back and forth to the water today as they are every day. The chief of the MacDonalds of Glencoe is MacLean. His full name is Alastair Mac Ian MacDonald, and he is an old man by the standards of this time and place, somewhere past 60 years. He is very tall. He is known across the region. His house at Carnock is larger than most in the glen, though not by a great margin. It has more than one room. It has some furniture beyond the basic, a chair of some kind, perhaps a table. But it is still a Highland house in February, still cold at the edges, still smoky at the centre, still lit by peat fire and tallow candles when candles are used at all. MacLean has spent part of this day dealing with a particular matter. 32 soldiers of the Earl of Argyll's regiment of foot have been quartered in Glencoe for the past 12 days. They came on the 20th of January under a Captain Robert Campbell of Glenlyon. They came with a letter explaining that their quarters at Inverlochy were full, and that the people of Glencoe should receive them and give them bed and board. The Glen has done so. That is the custom, and it has been followed. The soldiers have been eating at the tables of the MacDonalds, sleeping in their houses, sitting at their fires. This evening those soldiers are present in the houses of the Glen in the same way they have been for the past 12 days. They are at Inverrigan, at Achnacan, at Carnock. Campbell of Glenlyon himself is quartered somewhere comfortable, playing cards in the evening, as he has done on other evenings. Some of the soldiers have been reasonably companionable guests. Others have been a strain on households that do not have much to spare in February. They eat what is put in front of them. They sit at the fire. They are soldiers on winter quarters, which is a particular kind of idleness. The glen itself, at this hour, is almost entirely dark. There is no moon yet. The stars are very sharp in a clear, cold sky. Orion is visible above the southern ridge of the glen. The River Coe makes its sound, the steady, low sound of cold water moving over stones, and that sound is the constant of the night. The wind is light. It comes from the northeast, which means it carries cold but not great force. The heather bends a little. The thatched roofs hold. A dog barks somewhere near Achnacan, then stops. The sound crosses the glen floor and bounces once from the far slope and is gone. In one of the houses at Inverriggen, a child is being put to sleep. The child is wrapped in plaid, the same heavy woolen cloth that everyone in the glen uses as a blanket and a coat and a carrying cloth. The floor is the bed for most people. A layer of dried heather, another layer of rough cloth, the plaid pulled over. The floor is cold at the edges of the room and less cold near the fire. People arrange themselves accordingly. The older men of the glen are talking. They talk in Gaelic, which is the only language most of them have. There are some in the glen, including MacLean himself, who have some Scots English, but Gaelic is what runs beneath everything here, what the stories are told in, what the arguments happen in, what the day ends in. The conversation at this hour is the kind that belongs to the end of a working day in winter. The condition of a particular animal, the state of a particular patch of ground, the weather that is expected, the news that has come down from beyond the glen. There is news, and it is not simple. MacLean has known since early January that he needed to take an oath of allegiance to King William. The government in Edinburgh required it. The deadline was the 1st of January. He went on the 30th of December to Fort William to Colonel John Hill to swear the oath. Hill told him he had no power to receive it. MacLean had to go to Inverriggen to the sheriff. He went through the winter mountains and arrived on the 2nd of January, 2 days past the deadline. The sheriff, Sir Colin Campbell, administered the oath on the 6th. MacLean believed it was done. He believed the matter was settled. He does not know, on this first evening of February, what has been decided in Edinburgh. He does not know that his late arrival has been noted by men who wished to note it. He does not know that a letter authorizing military action against the Glen was signed on the 16th of January by the Secretary of State for Scotland, John Dalrymple, the Master of Stair. He does not know that the soldiers in his houses are there for a reason beyond winter quarters. The fire in the house at Carnock burns low. Someone adds 2 more peats, setting them carefully across the embers. The smoke rises in a slow column toward the hole in the thatch. The room is warm now, or warm enough. The meal has been eaten. The pot has been set aside. Outside, the frost is hardening on the ground. The River Coe runs on in the dark. The mountains are invisible against the night sky, enormous and close and entirely silent. The soldiers in the glen are sleeping or lying awake or sitting at other fires in other burrowed rooms. The glen holds all of them together in the dark and the cold of this particular February night, without any indication, in its silence, of what the next few hours. The last light leaves the sky somewhere past 4 in the afternoon. In February, darkness comes early to the glen. The mountains close in on either side, and the valley floor loses the sun long before the peaks do. By the time the light is fully gone, it is not yet evening by any clock. The glen runs roughly east to west. The River Coe moves through it, shallow and fast over stones, carrying meltwater down from the high ground. In winter, the river runs darker than in summer. It catches no light after dusk. It can be heard, though, from a good distance. The sound of it is constant. it does not pause. The houses of the MacDonalds of Glencoe sit close to the valley floor. They are not clustered in a single village. They are spread in small groups along the lower slopes and the flat ground near the river. There are perhaps 40 or 50 of these dwellings in total, stretching across several miles of the glen. Each one is a low, rectangular structure. The walls are built from the local stone, dry-laid or set loosely in earth. The roofs are thatched with heather or turf. From a distance, at this hour, they are nearly invisible against the hillside. There are no gas lamps in Glencoe in 1692. There is no street lighting of any kind. The concept of a lit street belongs to Edinburgh, to the closes of the old town, and even there it is limited. Out here, there is no such thing. When darkness falls over the glen, it falls completely. On a cloudy night in February, the darkness is total. There is no moon visible. There is no gradation between shadow and ground. A man stepping out of his door after dark would wait a moment for his eyes to adjust. On a night with heavy cloud, they would not adjust enough to see more than a few feet. The only light in the glen comes from fires. Inside each dwelling, a central hearth burns through the night. The fire is set on a flat stone in the middle of the single room, or sometimes against one wall, depending on the construction of the house. There is no chimney in the older style of building. The smoke rises and finds its way out through a hole in the roof, or through the gaps in the thatch, or simply collects in the upper air of the room and seeps outward through every opening. The smell of peat smoke in a settlement like this is not something a visitor would miss. It hangs over the whole place. It gets into wool, into hair, into the walls themselves. Peat is the fuel. It is cut from the higher ground in the warmer months, stacked to dry, and brought down before winter. A family that has prepared well will have enough peat stacked against the outside wall of the house to last until March or April. The fire burns low overnight. Someone in the household will have banked it before sleeping, covering the glowing turf with ash to hold the heat until morning. It is an old practice. The Gaelic word for it, smoring the fire, carries a sense of something more deliberate than simply letting a fire die. It is a management of warmth, a small act of foresight performed at the end of every day. The firelight does not reach outside. What escapes through the thatch or the door gap is minimal. A thin thread of smoke rises from each roof. In the dark, you would not see the smoke itself. You might smell it. You might, on a very still night, hear the faint shift and settle of burning peat. But the dwellings themselves give almost nothing away. They sit dark and low against the ground. The animals are close. The cattle are the most valuable possessions in the glen. Highland cattle in this period are smaller than modern breeds. They are kept alive through winter as breeding stock, as a measure of wealth, as something that will be moved to higher ground when the grass returns in spring. In February, they are brought in close to the settlement. Some are kept in a separate low enclosure, a byre attached to the end of the dwelling house, sharing the structure and its warmth. The sound of cattle at night is a slow, settled sound. There is breathing. There is the occasional shift of weight, a hoof on stone, the low sound of an animal turning in a confined space. It is not alarming, it is simply the sound of something large resting. Dogs are awake longer than people. The dogs of a highland settlement in this period are working animals. They are not large. They are used for herding, for guarding, for running ahead of livestock on the drove. At night, they move between the buildings. They are alert to things that people miss. A fox working the edge of the settlement would have one of them on its feet in a moment. The sound of a dog lifting its head and testing the air is not loud, but it is distinct. A low breath, a shift, a brief bark quickly silenced, then stillness again. The sheep are further out. They are hardy enough to stay on the lower hillsides through a mild winter night, gathered into a natural hollow or pressed against a stone dike. A dike in this context is a low wall of stacked stone, built to mark a boundary or to shelter animals. There are several of these on the valley floor and along the lower slopes. They are not mortared, they are simply placed. The sheep press against them for warmth and stand very still in the dark. The river is the clearest sound of all. The Coe in February is running fast. Snow has been melting on the higher ground above the glen, and the water level is up. The sound of it changes depending on where you are standing. Near the narrow section of the glen, where the valley walls come close together, the water moves faster and the sound is sharper. Out on the flatter ground to the east, the river broadens and slows and makes a lower, more rolling sound. At night, with no other sound competing, the river fills the whole glen. It is not silence. It is the opposite of silence, but it is a constant sound, and the ear stops registering it after a time, in the same way the eye stops registering a familiar wall. The mountains above are not visible at night in February under cloud. They are felt rather than seen. The weight of them, the cold coming off them, the way the wind moves down the slopes and arrives at the valley floor already chilled. Bidian Nam Bian rises to the south of the glen. It is the highest point in Argyll. In 1692, it has no name in English that anyone in the glen uses. Its Gaelic name means something closer to Peak of the Mountains. The people living below it know its every weather signal. A certain cloud formation above its summit means rain by morning. A clear outline at dusk means frost overnight. Frost is possible tonight. The temperature in Glencoe in early February regularly drops below freezing after dark. The ground is hard. Any standing water has a skim of ice on it by midnight. The stones of the walls are cold to the touch. The thatch on the roofs holds a little insulation, but not much. Inside the houses, the air near the fire is warm. Away from the fire, near the walls, the cold comes through. People sleep close together for warmth. Whole families share a sleeping space. The bedding is wool. The floor underneath is often covered with heather or bracken, which provides some insulation from the ground. Clothing does not come off at night. In this climate, in this season, a person sleeps in what they have been wearing through the day. The belted plaid, the main garment of a Highland man, is a large piece of woolen cloth. It serves as a cloak by day and a blanket by night. It is woven locally. in a pattern that belongs to the district rather than to a specific family. The dyes come from plants and mosses found in the glen itself. The colors are muted: ochre, dark green, brown, the dull red of bracken, nothing bright. Women wear a linen smock beneath a woolen outer layer. Children are dressed in smaller versions of adult clothing. There are no nightgowns in a settlement like this. The distinction between day clothes and sleeping clothes does not exist here. You wear what keeps you warm, you keep it on. By the time full darkness has settled, which in February means by 5 o'clock at the latest, most of the labor of the day is finished. There is not much that can be done by firelight that requires precision. Some women will spin by the fire. The drop spindle is the common tool here, though in some households a simple spinning wheel is in use. Wool is prepared, spun, and eventually woven into cloth for the family's own use. This is not a commercial activity. It is maintenance. It keeps the household clothed. Some of the men will have spent the shorter daylight hours attending to the cattle, mending tools, moving fuel. There is always work with the animals in winter. A beast that is not eating properly, a hoof that is causing lameness, a ewe that has separated from the others. These things require attention regardless of the cold or the hour. The tools used are simple: a wooden crook for moving animals, a stone-headed mallet for driving posts, a knife, always a knife, used for everything from cutting rope to butchering to carving wood. The evening meal, if it can be called that, is eaten before dark or just as dark falls. The main food in a Highland settlement at this time is oatmeal. It is prepared as porridge or as a thick cake cooked flat on a stone set over the fire. It is eaten with butter or with milk, if the cattle are producing any at this time of year, which in February is uncertain. Kale is grown in a small enclosure near each house, a kailyard, and survives into winter. It goes into a broth with whatever else is available. Dried or salted fish, if the household has managed to lay some by. A little salt meat, though meat is not abundant in February, when the autumn slaughter is months behind and the spring is months ahead. Cheese is made from summer milk and kept. A hard, sharp cheese pressed into rounds and stored somewhere cool and dry. It is eaten in small amounts. It is preserved food, not staple food. The same is true of any dried grain beyond oatmeal. The household stores in February are at their lowest point. The gap months between winter and the first crops of summer are the hardest. There is a reason that February and March have a particular weight in Highland memory. They are the months when people are tired, the food is running short, and the land is still cold and bare. Water comes from the river or from one of the burns running down off the hillside. The burns that come directly off the mountain are clean and fast and cold. They are preferred for drinking over the main river, which carries more peat sediment and runs darker. In winter, the burns run freely. They do not freeze at the lower levels. Higher up, where they emerge from the snowpack, there may be ice around the edges, but the flow continues. A person walking to fetch water before dark would follow a worn path to the nearest burn. The path would be muddy in thaw conditions, hard and ridged in frost. The last movements of the evening are small and unhurried. The fire is banked. The animals are checked one final time. A child is settled. A door is pulled to against the cold. There is no latch in the modern sense on many of these doors. A bar of wood set across the inside, a stone against the base. It keeps the wind out more than it keeps anyone out. The people of the glen are not, on most nights, concerned about the door. They know who is in the glen. They know who belongs here and who does not. The mountains and the narrow entrance to the valley are their walls. The darkness outside is complete by now. The river runs on in the black. The cattle breathe in the byre. On the hillside above the settlement, somewhere in the dark above the tree line, a raven shifts on its roost and tucks its head back under its wing. The cold presses down from the mountain. Smoke rises from the thatch in thin threads that the darkness swallows immediately. The glen is quiet in the way that only a glen can be quiet, not silent, but held as if.